Okay, well, thank you very much, Beth, and thank you everybody for joining us. And I'd like to welcome everybody to this presentation about Michigan Aviation. My name is Barry Levine, and I'd like to thank the Harbor Springs Historical Society for hosting me this evening. Just by way of background, I live in Canton, which is probably about 20 miles due west of downtown Detroit. My background and interest in aviation history started with my father, actually, who was in the Army Air Force in World War II, stationed up in the Aleutians. So no combat except shooting at a few caribou to get fresh meat. But he brought home some of his service manuals and some of his other stuff, and was always interested in it. I've now volunteered at the Yankee Air Museum in Belleville. So if anybody's down to Southeast Michigan, let me know. I'll be glad to take you around on a tour of the museum. I've written two books. In 2018, I published the Yankee Air Museum, of an Arcadia book about Yankee, and now this work that came out of in August of this year. As Beth noted, she has some in her at the Historic Society. They're on Amazon or on at Yankees gift shop if you ever come by. And this book, Michigan Aviation, is the source of tonight's presentation. I will say that freelance aviation and historic research is always fascinating and rewarding, but it often deals with inconsistent and ambiguous information. I try to sort it out as best I could, but it is an imperfect process. First of all, I'd like to thank everybody behind this book and this tonight's presentation, starting with my family, my wife Carol, and my kids Dan and Jessica. Rick Wiles, if he's on the phone tonight, is involved with the Charlevoix and the Petoskey Historic Association. There's a wealth of information. A number of people at Kincheloe, Wordsmith, and Sawyer Air Force Base and personnel and family members contributed. You can see their names here. And at Yankee, provided an invaluable education and support. When I started there in 2015, I used to flatter myself I knew something about aviation history, and I was quickly disabused of that notion just talking to our people that work there and our guests. Whole new look at history. These two stories for tonight, both involving the Strategic Air Command of Michigan's aviation history. It's a small sample of the total story throughout our state. Part one deals with the B-52 crash off of Charlevoix, Little Traverse Bay in January 1971. 9 airmen lost their lives, and they are all pictured here. But it could have been an environmental disaster, as the B-52 went down 5 miles north of the Big Rock nuclear plant, which was the target for that day's mission in Little Traverse Bay. Part two deals with Kincheloe Air Force Base, a proxy for the 3 Strategic Air Command bases in northern Michigan, which include Wordsmith and Sawyer, and much more on those later. First topic will be the B-52 crash. A series of events led to the night of January 7th, 1971, and you can see the headline from the next day's newspaper. Cold War, intense training levels by SAC, U.S. interest in nuclear power was seen as a wave of the future, including a plant at Charlevoix, something called radar bomb scoring technology used to measure bomb crew accuracy, and the use of aging B-52C aircraft for training missions were all part of the story. After the war, there were ongoing tensions with the Soviet Union, China, and their satellites between those countries and the United States. Had episodes such as the Berlin airlift, the Korean War, the Bay of Pigs crisis, the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is as close a call with World War III as you'd ever want to come to, the conflict in Laos, Vietnam, and Cambodia, and there was constant concern that this would evolve into a hot war, nuclear exchange with the Soviet Union. The Strategic Air Command, commonly referenced as SAC, was part of the U.S. offensive strategy and would attack Soviet targets with nuclear weapons or conventional bombs if so ordered by the president. SAC bases were located all over the United States, including Westover Air Force Base near Springfield, Massachusetts. Westover is part of tonight's story. And as a side note, Westover was named after Oscar Westover, who was Army Air Force Chief of Staff in the 30s. Westover was from Bay City, Michigan. The Boeing B-52 Stratofortress, which you see here, has been, is, and will continue to be a key part of the U.S. arsenal. First flown in 1952, it was a monster aircraft, 8 jet engines, weighs over 450,000 pounds fully loaded, and includes up to 70,000 pounds of ordnance. With mid-air refueling, it could reach targets anywhere in the world, typically a 6-man crew. B-52C, such as you see here, were delivered to the Air Force in 1956 and 1957. Boeing introduced a series of models during production as the Air Force requested various upgrades. This cockpit is the inside of a B-52. We have one on display at the Yankee Air Museum, and that is this cockpit very similar to the what the crew was using on the night of the tragedy. Meanwhile, nuclear power was part of the equation. The first U.S. nuclear power plant came online in 1958 in Pennsylvania. As a kid, I toured the Connecticut Yankee plant in the 60s back home in Connecticut. It was seen as a limitless amounts of energy. They gave all the kids some comic book extolling the wonders of nuclear power. I wish I had saved it, but I'm sure it's long gone. In any event, Consumers Power decided to build a nuke plant near Charlevoix, near Big Rock, which you see pictured here. It's a geologic formation that was used as a gathering place by native tribes. Its formal name became the Big Rock Point Nuclear Power Plant. Can't say they know the man's name here in the picture, but there he was, early selfie, I guess, of some sort. The construction began in 1960 for Big Rock and was completed in October 1962. The plant was used for research and power generation. A byproduct was cobalt-60, which was used for medical treatment. And you see this bluish green dome on the right where I have the cursor. That was the target, if you can believe it, for the January 1971 mission. There was a 1962 promotional video with Ronald Reagan before he became governor and certainly before he became president about the plant. And it was a big tourist attraction up there. About 500,000 people had come through by 1968 at the visitor center. So it was a popular spot for people to come. Concurrently with the nuclear mission, you have to bear in mind SAC relentlessly trained its crews. On a sample mission, they might simulate bombing runs on targets to what would be attacked in the Soviet Union, such as a nuclear power plant. And to measure accuracy, the Air Force used radar bomb scoring, or the acronym RBS, which essentially involves electronic signals to and from the bomber to the ground crews who track the results. And this is an aerial view of Bayshore RBS Station, so it's right down the road from the Historic Society. These two photos show the interior. The facility had been in Ironwood, Michigan, then moved in 1963 to Bayshore, which was just off of US 31. The group was designated as the first Combat Evaluation Group, Detachment 6. It's very small. There was no housing on base. There was no food service. Some local news references described it as being up the road from a small convenience store with a few stray dogs nearby. So you're trying to conjure up, you have all this high-tech equipment, and just down the road, somebody's going down for a Slurpee at the local 7-Eleven or something. Personnel lived in area towns, and they used the Charlevoix High School gym on Saturday mornings to work out. This is not a staged photo. It's an actual shot of a B-52 over the plant. Obvious risk where the aircraft often flew over the plant at very low altitudes. The B-52s didn't fly over the RBS facility, which you think they might, as the electronic signature was not good. So they used that dome that I had on a few slides ago as the target. As you might expect, area residents complained about the noise and safety concerns, and the Air Force essentially said, tough, we need this for national security, so live with it. Part of the equation was then Congressman Jerry Ford, when he was House Minority Leader. He wrote a letter on behalf of Consumers Power to the Air Force, noting increased insurance premiums to the power company 3 weeks before the crash. That letter was not responded to. All that set the stage for January 1971. Hiram 16 was the code name for that night's mission from Westover. 9 crewmen were on board. It was a bigger complement than usual. Some were on board for training purposes. All 9 were highly skilled, capable airmen. Some, and I think maybe all of them, were Vietnam vets. I'm just not certain. Lieutenant Colonel William Lemon was the pilot aircraft commander. He had a long series of outstanding proficiency reports, so this man was a very high-skilled B-52 pilot. All 9 of these men were married, and between the 9 marriages, there were 17 children. The mission that night was to fly from Westover, hit 4 targets electronically, and then return home. Other tasks, such as mid-air refueling, were also on the checklist for that evening. It should have been a routine training mission. I'm not a pilot, and I'm not going to pretend to be, but in my view, the word routine B-52 mission is an oxymoron. There's always risk. They're traveling at high speeds. They're very complex aircraft. Much could go wrong. There was a high pace of operations that stretched flight crews and ground support. There were any number of B-52 two crashes in non-combat flights, both in the U.S. and overseas, once operations began in the 50s. B-52s at low altitude left black smoke jet exhaust, so the flights became known as oil burner routes, and then further abbreviated to OB, like you see up here. And the OB-9 route was being flown that night over parts of Canada through the UP, and then you can see the targets down here, including Charlevoix's nuclear power plant. The mission took off from Westover before 2 p.m. on January 7th, 71, so we just hit the 50th year anniversary earlier this year. Weather was not a factor, so it wasn't a blizzard, wasn't an ice storm, none of that. The 4 targets were to be bombed. Big Rock was codenamed Charlie, was the 4th of 4 targets for the evening. Lemon's B-52 airframe had many air hours, given SAC's extensive training program. An added complication, B-52s were originally designed for high altitude missions. Then Soviet air defenses improved and lower altitude flights became the norm. Just like I'm not a pilot, I'm also not an engineer, but I've read several accounts indicating that low altitude flying can increase mental fatigue and shorten the service life of components such as wings on aircraft. So we'll have more on that later. By 6:30 that night, 3 out of the 4 targets have been bombed. The RBS radar operators at Bayshore then saw a large blip and then absolute silence from Hiram 16. There was no distress call of any sort. The bomber was traveling at about 350 miles an hour, which my math computations would have been over the reactor in 1 minute. So the next day's headlines look something like this. There was a huge explosion in Fireball when the fuel aboard when it impacted the water about 5 miles north of Big Rock and Little Traverse Bay. Residents thought it looked like a sunset, except it was in the wrong direction, and the lake should have been very dark at that time of day in January. Homes in the area shook as if an earthquake occurred. An off-duty RBS airman was at home, saw the flash and heard the explosion. He and a buddy of his went down to the shoreline thinking a freighter exploded. Up at Kincheloe, they received a call from one of the gunners about the crash. Even though they knew it wasn't one of their aircraft, they gathered in the ready room, and it was a long, difficult night as the bad news continued to come in about what happened. The wreckage covered a wide area, and here's a map with the approximate crash location. Here's Charlevoix, here's Petoskey, and here's Harbor Springs, so you're right in the neighborhood. So they searched there were no human remains were ever recovered. They searched for a few weeks right after the crash, and then there was a late January blizzard, and they called off the search until spring. Navy and a private salver searched for wreckage when the search resumed. Remnants were sent to Kincheloe for investigation. Kincheloe airmen were asked if they would volunteer to search the shore for wreckage, and a number did so. The U.S. Coast Guard cutter Mackinac, which is now on display in Mackinac City, was also part of the search. The remnants that they did find were inspected by Boeing and the Air Force. The conclusion was that metal fatigue in the wing between the first and second engine pods caused part of the wing to fall off. And a B-52, I'm sure that's exactly what happened. The B-52 would be totally and utterly uncontrollable, especially with only 700 feet of altitude to play with. So it was a complete shock to the Westover community, as you can imagine. Families and friends had to deal with this nightmare, and the families heard virtually nothing from the Air Force, so there was very little in the way of closure. There were some rumblings about pilot error, blaming Lemon. And of course, he was dead, so he couldn't defend himself. But in any event, it simply wasn't true. It was if metal failure on part of the airframe, Lemon did nothing wrong. There was a July 1971 memorial at Charlevoix. The Air Force did a tribute, including a B-52 flyover, F-106s in a missing man formation. These aren't F-106s, but it gives you the idea. And a bugler playing taps were part of this ceremony. The Air Force, after this, ultimately grounded the remaining B-52Cs to preclude another tragedy of this sort. There were rumors in the area of hydrogen bombs in the bay, which is simply not true, as Hiram 16 had no bombs on board of any type. However, there have been a number of air accidents involving nuclear weapons in U.S. plants, and they're called broken arrows. One such event happened in Spain in 1966. 4 hydrogen bombs were dropped near Palomares, which is on the border of the Mediterranean, when a B-52 collided with a tanker aircraft. All 4 weapons were recovered. So if you ever want to look what part of a hydrogen bomb looked like in 1966, that's it. There was no nuclear blast, but some of the conventional explosives on the weapons detonated, dispersing radioactive plutonium dust across some of the Spanish countryside. Despite all this, SAC wanted to continue in these missions as the Cold War was still going on. Ralph Nader wrote to the Atomic Energy Commission, why weren't the flights suspended sooner? The Air Force and the power plant builders investigated what would have happened had the wreckage actually hit the reactor, which is not impossible. It was 1 minute away, and that was the target, so it certainly could have happened just like that. And the findings were, we didn't think the reactor would be compromised if a B-52 crashed on top of it. You be the judge. It seems optimistic at best case. The Air Force did agree to a wider track around Big Rock, so that ended the direct overhead flight, so that's a positive. Bayshore was decommissioned in 1984, and the nuclear power plant itself was decommissioned late in the 1990s. There's still nuclear material on site. Who would want this stuff? We certainly don't want it down here in Canton, I can assure you of that. It is buried. My understanding is it's buried underground, it's guarded. No obvious answer on where to ship because who wants it? And we wouldn't even want to transport through Michigan. It's right there. The transportation involves risk. If the reactor was compromised, you could have had a situation like this. This is a picture of the Fukushima nuclear reactor in Japan, where a tsunami caused equipment failure in 2011. There were no deaths directly identified with the reactor, although the tsunami was a horrible, horrible mass casualty event. It was a huge economic dislocation. People had to evacuate, and then they slowly returned to the area. Consider the nuclear contamination in a 50-mile radius from Charlevoix. There's some little maps, Google Maps program, and I drew the circle around it. So you had the potential for loss of life, environmental damage, economic ruin. What if you had to close the bridge, which was certainly a distinct possibility? Tourism, agriculture, entire local economy would have been devastated, and for years. Of course, there's a human element to all this. Rick Wiles, as a local historian and teacher, helped organize the 2011 memorial. It's a big help to me with this story. Wiles mentioned the irony of these Vietnam vets surviving combat missions in Southeast Asia and then returning home and being killed in a training accident. That was attended by Major Russo's widow and daughters. All appreciated Wiles' efforts, which helped bring closure to the family. So who were these men? That's from the memorial in 2011. A few examples. Major Don Rousseau was from Morgantown, West Virginia. He was an electronics warfare officer. He flew over 100 wild weasel missions in Vietnam, looking to take out SAM missile sites, a very high risk way to make a living. Captain Joel Hirsch was another electronics warfare officer. He's from Western Springs in Illinois. He had 2 tours in Vietnam and was planning to return to the civilian world and then go to graduate school. Lieutenant Doug Bachman was the co-pilot. He went to Highland Park, New Jersey. He was from Highland Park, New Jersey, lettered in 3 sports in high school, attended Rutgers, and then joined the Air Force. His friends back home set up a memorial fund in his honor, and a friend of mine at the Yankee Air Museum was a frat brother of Bachman's at college. The photograph here is Tech Sergeant Jerry Atchey, who was the only enlisted man on board that night. He was from Ocean City, Washington. He was a gunner on AC-47s in Vietnam, another good way to get yourself killed. This photo was posted by a woman named Elizabeth Atchey Bove. His wife, his daughter, I don't know. What I do know is it's hard to imagine that grief ever goes away for any of the families. Family members of the crew gathered with Westover's senior leadership in early January 2018, unveiling a memorial painting by Airman Bill Pope. I guess he's an artist on the side and does some terrific work like this picture, this drawing. And there's a memorial at Lake Michigan Shore Roadside Park that was installed in 1971. The photo was taken on a 2020 family vacation. You look out at a peaceful scene in the bay, and it was a beautiful day when we were there. The bay is as calm as can be, a few people out on boats, fishing, it's just no sweat at all. And then you try and conjure up a B-52 falling out of the sky and hitting the water, and it's impossible. It's one of those things you just can't imagine. So that's the first part of tonight's story. The second part deals with the Strategic Air Command, or SAC, with a focus on Kincheloe. We had three such bases here in Michigan. This is Kincheloe's in Kinross. This is the flight line. Back when it was open, these are all closed now. Wordsmith is in Oscoda. It was named after Detroit's General Paul Wordsmith, as you see on the right. Wordsmith was recognized by General MacArthur for his efforts in World War II, and he was killed in 1946, I think, in an Air Force plane crash. Sawyer is in Gwynn, just south of Marquette. It's named after Kenneth Sawyer on the left. He was prominent in the area in the early 1900s. All three of these bases had small beginnings in or before World War II. They significantly ramped up in size, personnel, and facilities during the Cold War. And then as the Cold War wound down, there were budget cuts. All three bases were closed with a huge impact on local economies. All three of these bases made significant contributions to the national defense in Michigan. In the early days, Kincheloe, which is in Kinross, 20 miles south of Sault Ste. Marie, just off of I-75, it was called the Auxiliary Airfield. It was built in World War II to help defend the Sulaks, which is seen as critical to the national defense. The field reverted to civilian control after the war, and then the Air Force regained authority as the Cold War ramped up and became Kinross Air Force Base in 1952. Racco Army Airfield was also part of Kincheloe. This is about 20 miles northwest of Kinross near Route 28. The Racco acronym came from the Richardson and Avery sawmill in the 19th century that was in the area. It was also the site was also a civilian conservation corps camp in the 30s and an auxiliary airfield in World War II. It was activated in 1960 as the Kincheloe Air Force Base Beaumark site. Beaumark combines Boeing and the Michigan Aero Research Center, which used to be down here in the Detroit area. They developed the first long-range anti-aircraft missile ever deployed at Racco and other locations. Here's an example that you can see here. One airman stationed at Racco in the mid-60s said there were 8 men on station, and then a cook came out on Friday afternoon. He or she stayed through to Monday morning and made meals for the guys, and I guess they had leftovers for the rest of the week. Used to go drag racing out in the old runways, which they said was better than getting lost in the forest. In the late 1950s, Michigan's Ivan Kincheloe becomes part of the story. Kincheloe is from Detroit, born in 1928, grew up in Cassopolis, and graduated to Wajiak High in 1945 near Battle Creek. He was a top U.S. Air Force pilot. He was an ace in Korea with 5 enemy aircraft shot down, and then became a test pilot. On one flight in 1956 in an X-2, which essentially is a jazzed up rocket, he achieved 50 miles altitude, and some people consider him our first astronaut as he was on the boundaries of outer space. Kincheloe was killed in July 1958 when the engine in his jet failed. He ejected too low to the ground and his parachute did not properly deploy. The airbase thus was renamed Kincheloe Air Force Base in 1959. The ceremony was attended by his parents and his widow. Kincheloe was inducted into the Michigan Aviation Hall of Fame in 1996 and the National Aviation Hall of Fame in 2011. So what went on at these bases? One of the things that went on was Air Defense Command, which goes by the acronym ADC. And this is a shot from Kincheloe. Its mission was the detection, interception, identification, and if necessary, the destruction of hostile aircraft in defense of the continental United States. So in 1964, 110,000 military and civilian personnel were involved in this effort, so it was enormous. In the Sioux area, they were called out about once a week for unknown incidents. They had alert radars at various locations in Michigan, such as Sault Ste. Marie. It's now abandoned. I'm pretty sure it's near the Walmart up there because it's a structure that just looks like it'd be an ADC radar site. Their goal was to be airborne in 5 minutes to takeoff in case the Soviets penetrated our outer air defenses. The aircraft were fueled and armed, ready to take off. Some pilots slept in their aircraft just to save time. And that doesn't look like a real comfortable place to bunk down for the night. Sonic booms occurred in the Sioux routinely. It shattered windows, cracked plaster, just part of living up there in the 1960s. The airmen would only break the sound barrier if it was needed for their mission. And then residents were advised that since the sonic boom is not as loud as a bomb, so when you hear it at night, you can roll over and be thankful. So good to know. Another factor that was a constant was the weather. One Kincheloe Airman ground crew recalled going out to an aircraft in 32 below air temperature, 57 below degree wind chill. I'm picturing turning a wrench on metal aircraft at those temperatures. That does not sound like fun. In the northern bases, the snow could be so deep that aircraft taking off could not be seen until it lifted above the snow walls lining the runway. The Strategic Air Command arrived in Michigan in the 50s and became the ADC's host. This is a drawing of General Curtis LeMay, who was a real architect of SAC throughout the 50s. He believed relentless training and practice missions were essential to do the job right under high-stretch situations. His strategic plan for a war with the Soviets were pretty simple. He wanted to leave the USSR a smoking radioactive ruin in 2 hours. So we weren't fooling around back then. They had bases dispersed throughout the U.S., increased survivability in case of a Soviet first strike. The military liked the bases of Michigan because there was less flying time to the Soviet Union than from bases in the South. Kincheloe became part of SAC in 1959. Kincheloe was home to a wide range of fighters, bombers, maintenance, and ground support units. In February of 59, the runways were expanded to 12,000 feet length to accommodate B-52s, which need a ton of real estate to land and take off. And in 1961, H-model B-52s arrived at Kincheloe, configured to carry nuclear weapons. All Michigan bases were part of the Cold War missions, such as dealing with the Cuban Missile Crisis. And here's the leadership at the time of the three main players. In October 1962, the U.S. learned of Russian missiles in Cuba. Very tense deliberations in both countries on how to respond. The military alert was at DEFCON 2, and that was the only other time we were in this, to my knowledge, was during the early days of the Gulf Wars. The next step, DEFCON 1, means either nuclear war was imminent or has already started. So everybody on base, long shifts, high pressure. A lot of airmen were not that far removed from high school. So if you're a 19 or 20-year-old kid, to me, what you should be thinking about are jobs, cars, your girlfriend. You shouldn't be looking into the nuclear abyss. Major General E.G. Schuler was a lieutenant at the time in Texas at a B-52 base. His comments would fit any of the Michigan locations. There were no training flights, no ground school, no nothing. We were cocked and ready to go to war. Cuba was short duration and mercifully resolved minus nuclear war. Other assignments lasted for years. Crews participated in something called Operation Chrome Dome. These were very long missions, so the B-52 would be loaded up with nukes, already airborne, and they could have received orders to attack the Soviets. So if you're already here to Greenland, it's a short hop over the North Pole, and you're already into the USSR. These missions were described as complex, challenging, and exhausting. The B-52 crew area is tiny. It's a huge aircraft, but there's a minimal amount of space for the crewmen. And I've been in the cockpit of Yankees B-52. It is not the Holiday Inn. Alert missions were another aspect of B-52 and tanker crew life. The usual setup was you'd be on alert for 1 week, 24 hours a day, then off and on regular duties for the next 2 weeks. The alert goal for the B-52s and tankers, 15 minutes to get to the aircraft and be ready for takeoff. Some accounts had aircraft getting airborne in less than 10 minutes. The crews worked, trained, ate, and slept together in something called the crew readiness room, better known as the mole hole. This, you might be able to go to the base movie theater, but the deal was everybody had to go together, same vehicle, and if the klaxon went off, you rush out to the car, out to the flight line, everybody else had to pull off the road to let you through. And if the klaxon did go off, what are you thinking? Is this a drill or is this a one-way trip to Armageddon? And if you made it back, what on earth would you be coming back to? Because presumably our bases would have been first targets for the Soviets. And this is I've read somewhere this was a stage shot. You see it all the time, but it gives you an idea of what our guys were doing. They were running out to those airplanes, so this was not a walk in the park. In-flight refueling was critical. Boeing's KC-135s were used for years for this. They were at all three Michigan bases. It's a cousin of the 707 airliner. There's a boom operator handling the boom on the refueling aircraft. So you're flying at 275 knots or thereabouts, maybe 20 to 30 feet apart. You could be at night, you could be in bad weather, high winds. So this is another challenging task. In Vietnam, the tanker crews, such as those from Michigan, were credited with something called saves, in that you'd be refueling fighters and bombers so those crews could avoid ejections and crash landings over enemy territory. Refuelers might be called TOADs by the bomber crews. The acronym TOAD standing for takeoff and die, in that the tanker had to give all available fuel to B-52 to complete its mission. And if you couldn't make it back to base, well, it's too bad. In turn, the tanker people called the bomber crews pukes. By the mid-1960s, Vietnam's ramping up. All Michigan SAC bases sent crews to support the Vietnam effort. B-52s began missions in the mid-60s. They flew from Guam, Thailand, and Okinawa, as no Vietnam base was big enough for B-52. December 1972 saw Linebacker 2, President Nixon's effort to bring North Vietnam back to the negotiating table. So 11 days of intensive air campaign, very controversial here in the U.S. In North Vietnam, our POWs who were in locations such as the Hanoi Hilton cheered when they heard the heavy bombing because they feared it would be their ticket home, and those guys were exactly right. Now, local connection, a B-52 with the code name Ebony 2 was part of a December 26, 1972 mission. That crew had been based at Kincheloe. On the right was the pilot, Captain Robert Morris. Also on board were First Lieutenant Robert Hudson, the co-pilot, First Lieutenant Dwayne Vavrick, the navigator, Captain Mike LeBeau, the radar navigator. Pictured on the left is Major Nutter Wimbrow III, who was an electronic warfare officer, and Tech Sergeant James Cook, who was a gunner. He wasn't Kincheloe base, he was a late ad. The guy that was on board got sick, apparently. They hauled him off, and as the thing's getting ready to taxi out, they rushed Cook out to the flight line. Wimbrow and Morris, the morning of the mission, got their hair cut in Thailand as they wanted to look good on Hanoi TV. If they were shot down, became POWs. That bit of gallows humor wasn't so funny that night because that night, 3 surface-to-air missiles exploded near or on Ebony 2 over Hanoi. The B-52 rolled over on its back. Must have been horrifying to experience and see. Wimbrow and Morris died in the incident. Cook was severely injured on ejection. He ended up having both legs amputated. He and the other surviving crew repatriated home in 1973. This photo is from a 2009 memorial at Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri. So you see Cook, Hudson, LeBeau, and Vavrick. The woman here is Nancy Morris Ox. She was Captain Morris's wife, and apparently she remarried. So what was the impact of all this? Linebacker 2 concluded December 30th, 1972. Peace talks resumed in Paris early January 1973, and the ceasefire accords were signed with North Vietnam on January 27th of that year. Shortly after, the U.S. began bringing home its POWs, and our combat involvement concluded, leading to scenes such as this. This photo is known as Bursts of Joy, and it's one of the best-known photographs coming out of the Vietnam War. It shows a reuniting of Lieutenant Colonel Robert Sturm and his family. Photographer Slava Vetter won the Pulitzer Prize for this shot, and why not? It's a great, great photo. Just one wrinkle, Sturm and his wife were soon divorced. Sturm had been given a Dear John letter from his wife by one of the base chaplains a few days before the scene. Apparently, she had gotten involved with some other guys when it was a POW, and it was just a mess, and they were divorced shortly after this. Military flying was and is a high-risk profession, whether it's combat or not. Accidents have occurred involving personnel at all 3 bases. In November 1953, Air Defense Command spotted an unidentified object in restricted airspace over Lake Superior near the Sioux Locks. F-89C Scorpions were scrambled. You can see part of one here. This is First Lieutenant Felix Moncla, who was the pilot that night, and working the radar was Second Lieutenant Robert Wilson. They followed this unknown aircraft, or whatever it was, for 30 minutes. They catch up to it over the lake at about 8,000 feet altitude. The blips converged on radar. The F-89 signal disappeared, and then the unknown object disappeared. No wreckage or human remains were ever found. We asked the Canadian military, and they said, not ours, and became something of an urban legend about UFOs causing the disappearance. In another tragedy, and unfortunately these weren't the only 2, there were more than this. In September 1976, a KC-135, which is one of the refueling tankers, had 20 people on board, crashed near Hubbard Lake, which is outside of Oscoda. 15 of the 20 died in the incident. There was a pressurization problem on board. The flight originated at Sawyer, stopped at Kincheloe, and was heading to Wordsmith before its final destination of Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska. This follows from a 2016 reunion of the survivors at the 40th anniversary of the tragedy. So apparently these, I don't know who was who, but these were the 5 guys that survived. Of course, life on base was an all-military business. In 1975, President Ford landed at Kincheloe in Air Force One, and then took a helicopter to Mackinac Island to meet with Governor Bill Milliken, and he shook hands with some of the air personnel on base. Personnel I've talked to often have many good memories of their time on base, although airmen from the South might have a bit of a hard time adjusting to snowfall. A number of relationships, marriages, and lifelong friendships emerged from their time here. Keith Stanton, who was a Kincheloe crew chief, noted how everyone pulled together and relied on each other. They were isolated from any sort of big city. The weather was awful in the winter. Everyone had a role to play, and Kincheloe was very highly thought of within the military as a well-run operation, regardless of who was in command. Many obvious benefits in terms of military, civilian jobs on base, with a lot of positive impact on the local community and schools. Kincheloe had something on the order of 3,200 military and 700 civilian jobs on base. High school kids went to school in nearby Rudyard. Local educators noted that the military and local kids got along well. Military kids would share their experiences from travel in and out of the United States with people from the local area. Bases were used, and there's a winter scene from Kincheloe. Bases have appeared in the movies. Wordsmith was used in 1948's Fighter Squadron with Robert Stack and Edmund O'Brien. Kincheloe was used to film parts of Die Hard 2 long after it was closed. So time passes and things change. RACO was deactivated in 1972. Kincheloe's closure was announced in 1965 for 1971. There was political pushback, delayed closure until 1977. Sawyer and Wordsmith crews, as they were still open, both participated in our conflicts with Iraq. They were then closed in the early 1990s, along with many other SAC bases. Very hard on the local economy and various efforts to rebuild and recover. Kincheloe Airfield is now Chippewa International, which you see here. Service on Delta Airlines, there's private aviation, there's some prisons in the area. Sawyer is now Marquette's airport, and I believe it has the longest runway in Michigan, although the other two SAC bases have to be close. Wordsmith now houses Calida Air Maintenance, part of a big air freight business, which is based down our way here in Ypsilanti outside of Detroit. Environmental concerns are part of the equation. An ongoing problem at all Michigan SAC bases was chemical residue from military operations in the water and soil. The acronym PFAS, it's a long word behind it. I'm not even going to try and pronounce it. It represents a group of man-made chemicals. So you have stuff like firefighting agents, fuel, and hydraulic fluids all in base contribute to these contaminants. I stayed in Oscoda in 2020. The hotel lobby had a warning sign, "Don't eat fish from the Osable River." So it's still an issue. And there's been many accounts about long-term health impact of military personnel on base as well as area residents. There's lots of frustration in the local communities as it's very expensive to clean up, takes years to complete, and there's no obvious end in sight that I'm aware of. These three people, this is a 2016, 2017 photo of the St. Francis Community Center in Gwinn, which was where Sawyer was. That area in particular has had a very hard time with poverty, unemployment, drug use, crime, you name it. Some progress is being made. There's now some retail and condos in the area, now on site in the Gwinn area. Much more is needed. The future is uncertain. There's still a lot of dilapidated, boarded up, abandoned properties. Kincheloe seems to have done a little bit better. In a 40-year anniversary article for Kincheloe in 2017, the area has been rehabilitated. A woman named Tammy Bissot was the airport manager at the time. She said after 40 years, jobs are back, the buildings are full, and the runway is still flying airplanes. There's a Chippewa County Economic Development Corporation to help things out in the area to convert from military to civilian use, and I believe there's analogous groups in the other two areas. Some good news. Northern Michigan is planned for use for space operations, impacting all three areas. I've read one account that says there's a potential for 40,000 jobs, which seems like a lot. Some estimates are lower, but still jobs are jobs, so that's a good thing. There's a group called the Michigan Aerospace Manufacturers Association, announced that Kincheloe site was selected as a command and control center for satellite launching. They want to build launch sites on the lake in Marquette County. This is an artist's rendition of that. And at Oscoda Wordsmith, there are some concerns about the environmental impact of this, especially on a pristine shoreline. As you can imagine, this is up here. So some local groups were opposed. I don't know how it's going to play out. So to me, at least, it's a tremendously interesting history, but how do you keep the story alive? The Charlevoix incident was 50 years ago. The SAC bases closed 30 to 45 years ago. Memories fade, and there is no Kincheloe Air Force Museum base. There is a Wordsmith Air Museum base seen here on the left, and this is the inside of the K.I. Sawyer Heritage Museum. People such as Judy and Chuck Schuler at Wordsmith and Lanny Duquette at Sawyer are doing a great job in maintaining this history. Both are staffed by dedicated volunteers dealing with limited resources. Both are well worth visiting. So both stories from today, the 9 men who were lost in 1971 in Michigan SAC bases, all played a part in winning the Cold War, among many other contributions. This photo shows the Berlin Wall coming down in 1989. In a broader sense, Michigan and its people made huge contributions to aviation, military, and civilian over decades. I'm glad I could share a few of those stories with you today. Thank you. Any questions for me?